Hello, and welcome to Golden State Media Concepts Relationships Podcast. I'm your host, John Johnson. And I'm going to ask, do your feelings confuse you? And I'm talking about love feelings. I'm talking about romance. I'm talking about that kind of stuff. Do you feel as though you love too much or too little? Do you wonder why you don't attract someone? Or maybe the type of someone that you're interested in? Are you jaded about romance or relationships? And do you see romantic relationships as a form of entrapment? Do romantic commitments make you uneasy? Or does having sex or the thought of being sexual make you want a relationship or not want a relationship? Again, these are all thoughts. So here's another question. Do you prefer friendship over romance? And what does it take for you to want a closer connection? Now, have you ever had a crush on let's say a best friend? Did it go towards being a romantic relationship or did it not? Sometimes that might wind up being the unrequited love. But, and here's another thought on that. If it ended, let's say it went to become a romance and it ended, was it because you wanted it to, it was mutual, or they wanted it to? Now, one of the other things that sort of comes to mind in that same regard is that, would you fall in love? And if you did, would you do so thinking that if it didn't work out, that you can go back to being friends? You see, I've known a lot of people who have had friendships and they said that they didn't want to lose the friendship, so they didn't want to turn it into romance. Now, for some people, they think, okay, well, that's just a smokescreen. There's that philosophy that I would only want to fall in love with a friend because we know who each other is. We've gone through a lot of trials and tribulations, and there seems to be some solid footing on how that works. I mean, that philosophy for developing a relationship based on the friendship seems to make a lot of sense, because it's about, in that case, it's about knowing what's going to happen over the long run. But then there's that free will kind of thing that pops up. And when it comes to the romance part, sometimes that chemistry is just overpowering. And whereas, it sounds great to take 3, 4, 5, 6 months working on the friendship and deciding if you want it to go elsewhere. And some people will even say, okay, after that period of time, I'm done with this and I'm going to move on to the next. But back to that scenario of taking that time for the friendship and seeing where it's going to go. Like I say, when that chemistry thing kicks in, it's like, phew, man, it's off. It's gone. It's off to the races. It's kind of like, oh, there's no waiting period on that one. They tend to go right to romance and have fun and enjoy it and say, okay, we're going to ride that thing. And some of us call that the honeymoon period. So you had the honeymoon period for a while, and, hopefully you've figured out enough things about yourself so that even though you're in the honeymoon period, you kind of know some things about how relationships should operate. So if you hit a bump in the road, you can figure out what to do about it without it being a catastrophe. So anyhow, I'm going to cover all of these things, and I'm going to go back to the first thing I'd mentioned. And that first thing was the loving too much or too little. So let's take the one about loving too much. Then, in that scenario, what we have is someone who just kind of dives in. And, you have people, and that's great, people who can be committed to something. And albeit when it's a relationship, it might be a bit overwhelming for some people to have that much coming at you all at one time. Some people might describe that as being a little overwhelming, and some people might even describe it as stalking. That's way over the top, but you get the point. When someone is really coming on really strong, and the irony about all of this is we have movies and songs and poems all describing these feelings, feeling a little overwhelmed and then expressing them to someone, with the idea that when we express that, it's going to move the needle, the direction that the person who's expressing all of this emotion wants it to go. But if you're the person on the receiving end of that, like I say, that may be a bit overwhelming. And overwhelming based on what you've experienced in life as to what you feel comfortable with. Because if it's too much, then it's scary. But if it's too little, then it's like the song says, you got to, keep at it, and then finally you will win them over. But there's, like I said, too much or too little. That's always a balancing act. And I imagine relationships themselves, especially when we're talking about romance, it's like two bullets trying to hit each other in the sky. That's a rare thing to have happen and to have it be successful. It's always a challenge. I think just the fact that we're human beings means it's going to be a challenge. But think about that analogy. Two bullets trying to hit each other in the sky. That's a hard thing to do. And finding people or a person, let's just say that, finding a person who is going to be on the same page with you or pretty close to it, that's a challenge. And clearly, when you feel like you've come across someone that might be in your range of how you like to operate, you tend to go for it. Or at least you like to feel like you want to, or you want them to know how you feel. And, why wouldn't you give it your best shot? Especially when you feel like maybe you've, in your past, have lost that love because you didn't give it an effort. So you put it out there and see what happens. I think one of the things that we learn about love is that it's a constant negotiation. Emotions, they rise and fall on things that we have no control over, especially when it comes to the other person. It's a constant negotiation. So hopefully you understand that the person that you get involved with, because of that dynamic of the negotiation, I hope you really, really enjoy that part of it. That's just part of the action. Expect it. Now, for those that I would describe don't love enough, meaning they don't put enough effort into being loving or want to invest in those types of feelings, you're just going to be left out until you learn to take that risk. I think the risk that I talk about is disappointment and heartache. That's described in songs too. A lot of lyrics have been written about losing love and what that feels like. And yeah, it sucks. It sucks a lot. But I think those who have been in love, most of the majority would say they'd rather have it than not, because it's a feeling like no other. Again, think about songs and poetry and expressions. Valentine's Day, there's a day that's devoted to love, right? I mean, I know it's a commercial thing, but the idea is it's about expressing yourself and showing love to someone else. So you have to invest in it, or you're going to give mixed messages to yourself, that is. And that's one way in which you can really confuse the heck out of yourself. Now, another thing that I think about is, do you see romantic relationships as a form of entrapment? I mean, think about it. Some people do. That's why some people really like the no strings attached kind of a thing. They don't want anything to stop them from having their freedom. They like to enjoy the idea of romance and attachment and love, be it physical, be it even in some sort of emotional connection, but they don't want to necessarily be tied to it in the form of a commitment, because the word commitment scares a lot of people. And I think you really have to learn to define what a commitment is to you, and then come together on that, because there's this perception about what it is. And I think the thing that I have found in discussing commitment with people is there are so many variables on that very subject. I got to take a break here, but I'm going to talk about commitment in a moment. But stay tuned.
The GSMC Sex Podcast is a show that examines all aspects of sexuality, from physical to emotional to spiritual. Join our hosts as they discuss age-old questions, common misconceptions, and the latest topics surrounding sex. They'll tackle topics about sexuality from the complicated to the hilarious and everything in between. GSMC Sex Podcast is your show for all of your questions about sex, even some you might not have thought of yet. Download the GSMC Sex Podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, Google Play, or anywhere you can find podcasts. Just type GSMC in the search bar.
Hello, and welcome back to Golden State Media Concepts Relationships Podcast. Now, when I left off at the break, I had started to get into commitment. Now, I'm going to read to you a textbook definition of commitment, and there's a couple of definitions I'm going to use here. There's a state or quality of being dedicated to a cause or an activity. You know, we're dedicated, we're devoted. There's an allegiance, a loyalty, a faithfulness, fidelity, bond, adherence, attentiveness, you know, that sort of thing. And then there's the other part where you making a commitment seems to restrict your movement. And that's where it becomes a responsibility, an obligation, a duty, a tie, a liability. And for some people, it's a burden. And it's that part of the definition of commitment is what scares a lot of people. Because being duty bound to something in particular, let's say monogamy. I'm just going to pick that because that's a much easier one. And the women that I've talked to have expressed this concern about guys because they say guys are commitment phobic, meaning that they can't seem to make a commitment to being in a relationship. And, you know, depending on what your experience is, if being free or feeling free feels better to you, then it's probably just the fact that that word, some people they just feel really strange about using. You know, you can actually be in a commitment without saying you're in a commitment. Some people, it's just the word. They feel like, oh, I'm going to jinx it. Like some people won't say, I love that person because they feel if I say I love that person, then I'm going to jinx it. Something about it's going to change, and hey, that's just people's reaction to stuff. So you know, maybe they need some therapy around that, but just consider: are they doing the action? Are they being committed? Are they operating like a committed person? And if they are, and they just have an issue with the word, then just compromise. You're getting what you want. But back to this idea about, you know, do your feelings confuse you? Sometimes it is the context in which we operate. And commitment is one of those. And I like to borrow that because I can relate to that. I mean, I at one time was one of those individuals that felt like if I said the word love, oh my gosh, then, I mean, does it actually change how I behave? At that point, no, because I think I'm already operating in a way that I feel I'm expressing that. It's just a matter of borrowing the word. So I'm not shaken by that, using the word love or commitment or anything like that. But at one time when I may have operated that way, I can see how there was a fear associated with that. So if you're dealing with somebody who seems like it's more of a word thing, like I said, if they're operating like they're loving and being committed, then just go with that. But somebody who is commitment phobic, that's a total different thing. I mean, you're not going to get them pinned down to anything. That's just not who they are. And if that's what you need in order to operate in the connection with that person, then you got to talk about that. and decide how that needs to look. And remember in the beginning I was talking about when it comes to commitment, you have to kind of define it for people. In part of this example, I was talking about, well, you see it operating, so it's there. In other cases, you need to sit down and maybe write out what does commitment look like to you? Because what I find in a lot of things in terms of clearing up misunderstanding is we really need to get down to understanding what the word means. For some people, commitment, it's modeled for them. They've seen it. Maybe they've operated it. They've been around people who have very good work habits, or they're really good at relationships, and they seem to be a good model for the word commitment. And then in other cases, people have seen what was supposed to be a committed relationship, and they don't work out. So in their mind, commitment is not a good thing, even if they're a good person. So that's an illustration of where in some individuals, and I'm going to use this word, they feel like, well, when we start putting titles on things, we're going to jinx it. Let's just go ahead and be it. Be flexible. So here's another one. And remember, I'm talking about, and the title of this is Do Your Feelings Confuse You? So does having sex or the thought of being sexual make you want a relationship or not want a relationship? So that may be more of a sex question in the sense that, how many people have gotten together because they wanted to have sex? There are a lot of marriages that got together because there was the religious mindset that, no sex before marriage, because we felt like we were being sinners. And if we do that, boy, we're really going to, mess something up here. It's whatever your belief system is. I'm not making fun. I'm just making an illustration of the fact that has been a driver of many relationships, is wanting to have a sexual partner. And making a commitment, making a relationship out of something because you wanted a lover, well, there are all kind of pitfalls to that. Because I think we know, after a while, you got to come up for air. You have to operate. You call it a relationship and you've got this love, this sexual thing happening, and you haven't worked out anything else of substance. Well, you're going to run into the ditch at some point in time and have to figure out that, hey, we don't get along. We don't solve problems the same way. We don't have any other values, but we have great sexual chemistry. That's a relationship that's going to have problems. But does the thought of that make you want to have a relationship or not want to be in a relationship? I'm talking about the sex. Because some people, sex is not something that they feel comfortable with. And they think if they get into a relationship that it has to turn physical. Again, that's something you got to talk about up front. Because I know how the passion works. For some people, it starts out, it's great, or one person has it and they figure they're going to talk the other person into it. There's all kind of ways these things move. And if you don't want a relationship because you don't want the physical intimacy, that's certainly your choice. You can decide that for yourself, and we all should have the freedom to decide that. But know that's a reason for you, and be okay with that. But if you happen to know someone, if you're interested in someone that might have that as one of their presets, then what do you do? What are you going to do about your feelings in regard to that? That could be a little bit thorny because you can't necessarily make them move that needle towards being with you if they don't want romance. They don't want intimacy. They just want to be friends. I'm going to take a break, and I'll be right back after this.
Tired of searching the vast jungle of podcasts? Now listen close and hear this out. There's a podcast network that covers just about everything that you've been searching. Hey! The Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network is here. Nothing less than a podcast bliss with endless hours of podcast coverage. From news, sports, music, fashion, cooking, entertainment, fantasy, football, and so much more. So stop lurking around and go straight out to the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. Guaranteed to fill that podcast itch. Whatever it may be. Visit us at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter, and download us on iTunes, SoundCloud, and Google Play.
Hello, and welcome back to Golden State Media Concepts Relationships Podcast. I'm John Johnson, talking about Do Your Feelings Confuse You? So in the first segment, I outlined a number of, scenarios, and they're fairly similar, but just posed a number of questions. In that second segment, I kind of waxed a little bit more about some of the thought process in this. Now, in this last segment, I'm going to try to tie it all together. And I think the common denominator here really has to do with the amount of risk you take. I mean, think about it. When we're talking about relationships, one of the tenets for a lot of people in terms of philosophy is they want to be friends first. They feel like, well, if they have a good friendship, then no matter what happens in the relationship, they can always go back to that foundation, and they know they've got something that they've built together, and we call it a friendship. And that's a very, very powerful thing to have. Friendships mean a lot to a lot of people. I like that philosophy. But there's also free will. And that's the human experience of chemistry and being in love, or what they feel is love. And that connection sometimes jumps way ahead of developing the friendship. But you have something that's really strong and very powerful that drives you. And in that case, there's someone who, or a pair of people who have decided that the risk in and of itself is worth taking. I mean, they have no idea what the future will hold. And none of us do. Even when you have a friendship that makes itself into, let's say, a committed relationship, long-term committed relationship. So when, so in mentioning risk, that kind of moves all over the place. But think about the example that I gave when somebody who is a commitment phobe, somebody that doesn't do well with commitments, or even the word, or those that worry about jinxing it. Is that about risk? Is that, and I think it is. It's about taking the risk. And some people have the experience, and check this out for yourself, but some people have the experience that taking a risk, if they haven't thought about it, if they do the analysis paralysis, then they can't do it. They can't go forward. And I liken that to the kinds of experiences that they've had in life. They don't have a lot of confidence about things. They try to maybe boil it down to numbers, or maybe a lot of anecdotes, and go from there. But when it comes to having the real life experience of their own, and maybe doing some problem solving around that, it's really, really tough for some people. So if you are one of those individuals, you have experienced that for yourself, this may really resonate with you as to why relationships, as far as getting serious, as far as, what you want to call it, why it is such a challenge for you. Well, you don't want to jinx it. I don't want to call it love. I don't want to call it a commitment. Those kinds of, it's really about the risk. And some people take the risk. The risk reward thing for them is, it's way up there. They dive right in. And as me, as a person who's watched that kind of thing happen, I applaud those individuals that really have that about them. To me, those are the ones who jump off the high dive and they have no idea what the experience is going to be like when they land in the water. Hopefully they land, feet first or able to dive in, because those of us who have jumped off a diving board and have had the belly flop or landed on the back, man, did we get a lesson? And what was that lesson? Don't do it again. That's what that lesson was. But for those who take that risk and it works out for them, that's great. Because those are the individuals that learn that taking a risk has a payoff. And I think you have to find in your own experience what risks you've taken that have had a payoff. I think all of us know fear from the beginning. There's so much unknown out there in life that makes us want to stop, pause, and think, okay, what's the next step? I remember my own experience in life. I used to be one of those that suffered from what I call analysis paralysis. Had to think about all of the possibilities and how to minimize the risk. And sometimes you just have to dive in. And I've done that on a few occasions, and it's worked out. Sometimes it hasn't. But living long enough sort of sharpens your intuition about what's a good risk or not. I don't believe in just jumping out there into the nothingness. It's not like having faith. That's a whole different kind of thing. Faith in and of itself is a powerful experience. But when I'm talking about the love thing from the perspective of about your feelings, about being confused, this isn't really about faith. This is about learning how you operate, what your experiences have been, and what has stopped you in the past from going forward with your love relationships. I happen to know a number of people who have wanted more for themselves than they've experienced, but have not been able to get past themselves and what stops them in order to have what they want in terms of a loving relationship. Some people tend to go back to what they already know, which isn't successful, which has been a failure. And sometimes what those situations bring about is that desire to rewrite their history, as if to fix something that's already broken about themselves. And they feel once they heal that, then they can move on. But we have a word for that, and it's called dysfunction. Counselors are really good at helping you find those things out about yourself so that you don't get stuck in your past trying to fix something that you can't possibly fix. Sometimes that dysfunctional thread is handed to you from past generations, and it gets passed down because it's modeled for you in terms of a kind of behavior. There's so many things about us that are like that. But once you become enlightened as to what those kind of things are and how they impact you, and oftentimes these are the kinds of things that have impacted how you love as well as who you love. Get some of that insight, and a lot of these things will find themselves fixed, and your feelings will be a little less confusing. I'm John Johnson. This is the Golden State Media Concepts Relationships Podcast.
You've been listening to the Golden State Media Concepts Relationship Podcast. part of the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. You can find this show and others like it at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Download our podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, and Google Play. Just type in GSMC to find all the shows from the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. From movies to music, from sports to entertainment, and even weird news. You can also follow us on Twitter and on Facebook. Thank you, and we hope you have enjoyed today's program.